Zeus, the king of the gods in Greek mythology, is often remembered as the supreme figure of Olympus, powerful, imposing, the one who wielded lightning in his hands and decided the fate of mortals and gods alike. But behind this glorious image, what can we really see when we observe his behavior more closely? Was his strength as solid as it seemed, or did it hide something deeper? Throughout the myths, Zeus presents himself as an absolute ruler who demands respect and obedience. However, alongside power come impulses, excesses, and contradictions. What might seem like mere whims of a distant god actually reveals behaviors very close to human nature. It's at this point that mythology stops being just ancient history and becomes a psychological mirror for us. And here emerges the central question. What can Zeus's behavior teach us about narcissism? About the ego and about the fragility we all try to hide? Could it be that the invincible image we construct, just as he did, is really a sign of strength or merely a way to mask deeper fears? In this video, we'll dive into this powerful yet contradictory archetype. We'll understand how Zeus, through his greatness and his flaws, helps us reflect on our own relationships with power, vanity, and the desire for recognition. After all, perhaps Olympus is closer to us than we imagine. If you enjoy videos about Greek mythology, psychology, archetypes, and even pop culture, subscribe to the channel. I'm sure many of our videos will make sense to you. Now, speaking of Zeus in Greek mythology, he emerges as the great ruler of Olympus, the one who assumed the throne after defeating Cronus and freeing his siblings from paternal tyranny. His lightning bolt, the ultimate symbol of authority, represented not only the force of nature, but also absolute dominion over the destinies of men and gods. He wasn't simply a political leader, but the very personification of cosmic order. However, this order wasn't static, or just in every sense. Zeus chose when to act as guardian of justice and when to let himself be carried away by his most human impulses. This made him a complex figure, capable of inspiring both reverence and fear. Being the king of the gods, however, didn't mean acting with constant balance. Zeus was marked by his impulsiveness and inability to control his desires. The stories tell of his countless romantic relationships, many of them permeated by deception, disguises, and even abuse of power. The god who should have been the symbol of balance frequently showed himself to be unstable, taken by intense passions and an insatiable desire for conquest. His infidelities, besides generating conflicts on Olympus, revealed a characteristic common in authoritarian leaders: the feeling that everything is permitted to them, that no rule truly limits them. This behavior wasn't restricted to the emotional sphere. Zeus was also known for his need to demonstrate power in all situations. Even being the supreme sovereign, he seemed incapable of fully trusting his position. The fear of being dethroned accompanied him constantly, and he took drastic measures to prevent his children or allies from becoming threats. In trying to control destiny, he often resorted to tyranny and manipulation. This insecurity, disguised under the appearance of strength, revealed that behind the lightning and throne, there was a shadow of vulnerability that Zeus could never admit. The way he administered Olympus also showed this duality. At some moments, Zeus appeared as a mediator, the one who resolved disputes between gods and maintained a certain order in the universe. At others, his stance was arbitrary, acting more for his own benefit than in favor of greater justice. This selectivity made him an unpredictable figure. No one knew for certain whether they would receive his protection or his punishment. Olympus, under Zeus's dominion, was a mixture of stability and tension, where all gods needed to measure their words and gestures to avoid awakening his sudden wrath. Another relevant point in his trajectory is how absolute power amplified his excesses. The more untouchable he felt, the more freedom he had to follow his desires without considering the consequences. This trait makes him a powerful archetype for reflecting on the impact of authority on the psyche. Zeus's dominion wasn't only over others, but also over himself, or rather over the difficulty in exercising this internal dominion. His behaviors show us how power can become a mirror that reveals, on a larger scale, human flaws and fragilities. Zeus also stood out for his constant need to be the center of everything. The myths place him as an essential character in almost all great Greek narratives, reinforcing the idea that nothing could exist without his participation. This centrality, however, wasn't merely literary. It reflected his vanity, the need to reaffirm his own place of prominence. He wasn't content to be just the king. He needed to be remembered at all times as such. This characteristic invites us to think about how leaders, public figures, and even ordinary people can incessantly seek recognition, as if external validation were the only way to sustain their own identity. It's interesting to observe how Zeus's figure carried, at the same time, traits of protection and threat. He was seen as one who could save entire cities with his intervention, but also as one who could destroy them in an instant of fury. This paradox made him a feared and revered god, loved and hated. There was no middle ground. Zeus always imposed himself intensely, and this reinforced his image of unquestionable power, but also of imbalance. The constant oscillation between benevolence and tyranny reflected a universal truth. The greater the position of power, the greater also the psychological pressure that accompanies the ruler. Thus, when analyzing Zeus in mythology, we perceive that he is much more than a simple thunder god. He represents the contradictions that arise when someone holds absolute power, the force that sustains order, but also the impulses that threaten to destabilize it. The courage to face external enemies, but the silent fear of losing his internal position. This ambivalence makes him a fascinating archetype for psychology, as it shows us how, behind greatness, there are always cracks that reveal the human side, or, in this case, all too human, even in a figure considered divine. The term narcissism, within psychology, isn't limited to vanity or the act of admiring one's own image. It's related to the constant need for external validation, the difficulty in dealing with vulnerability, and the desire to maintain a grandiose image before others. Deep down, narcissism reveals a tension. While on the outside, there is strength and superiority, inside there may be fear of rejection, insecurity, and emotional fragility. When we observe Zeus through this lens, it's impossible to ignore his incessant search to be at the center of attention. He didn't accept being just one god among others, but needed to be the god that everyone recognized as the most powerful. This centrality wasn't just political, but symbolic. In each myth, Zeus appears reaffirming his position, reminding other gods and mortals who was in charge. This behavior approaches that of the narcissist, who, in any human group, demands continuous recognition to feed their own ego. Another evident trait is his vanity connected to the throne and status. Zeus wouldn't give up symbols of power, the lightning bolt, Olympus, the title of king of the gods, because each of them reinforced his grandiose identity. Just like people who cling to positions, titles, or appearances to sustain their self-esteem, Zeus found in these elements the confirmation of his superiority. Without them, his image could be questioned, and that was something he wasn't willing to allow. In the field of relationships, Zeus's archetype shows a quite narcissistic pattern, seeing others as instruments of self-affirmation. His romantic conquests, for example, often weren't based on reciprocity or affection, but on the need to prove to himself his power of seduction and dominion. Each relationship wasn't just an encounter, but a way to reinforce his position of superiority. This dynamic is common in narcissistic personalities, who use bonds as a stage to validate their own grandeur. The difficulty in dealing with vulnerabilities also manifests strongly in Zeus's myth. Whenever he felt threatened, he reacted with aggression and control, as if admitting weakness were unthinkable. This refusal to show fragility is one of the marks of narcissism. The mask of strength must be maintained at any cost, even if it means hiding deep fears or repressing them with violence. In Zeus, insecurity was always behind his authoritarian face, driving his most drastic decisions. It's interesting to note that, despite all his grandeur, Zeus constantly needed to reaffirm his superiority. This shows that his power didn't bring him inner peace, but rather more demands. Narcissism works the same way. No matter how much someone is admired or respected, it's never enough. Something is always missing. The internal void, which should be faced and worked through, is masked by the incessant search for validation. And, as in Zeus's case, the more the search grows, the more it denounces the fragility behind it. Thus, Zeus's archetype as an expression of narcissism invites us to reflect on ourselves. To what extent do we seek recognition to feed the ego, instead of accepting our vulnerabilities with honesty? The myth of the king of Olympus shows that narcissism isn't just an isolated psychological trait, but a lens that can distort our relationships, our desires, and even our vision of ourselves. By understanding Zeus from this perspective, we don't just look at a distant god, but at a part that may dwell in every human being. Zeus's figure, when observed more closely, reveals a profound contrast between strength and vulnerability. On one side, he is the lord of the skies, the absolute king of Olympus, owner of the lightning bolt that symbolizes power and authority. On the other, we perceive a god constantly restless, insecure, and distrustful, always fearing to lose the position he conquered. This paradox shows us that his greatness was always accompanied by a shadow, a dark side he tried to hide. The idea of shadow, in psychology, refers precisely to these repressed aspects of personality, those we don't want to see. In Zeus's case, his shadow manifested in the difficulty of dealing with fragility and with the fear of being surpassed, which made him a prisoner of his own need to appear invincible. This constant fear of losing power functioned as fuel for many of his authoritarian attitudes. Zeus knew that his own story had begun with a rebellion. He overthrew Cronus, just as Cronus had dethroned Uranus. The memory of this cycle haunted him, and he feared being the next victim of the wheel of destiny. This insecurity reflected in harsh decisions, like punishing children who could threaten him or repressing allies who showed too much strength. With each authoritarian gesture, his shadow gained body, revealing that what seemed like a demonstration of leadership was, in fact, a defensive reaction before the fear of losing the throne. Thus, absolute power, instead of bringing him peace, imprisoned him in eternal vigilance. The need to hide his insecurities also became visible in his public posture. Zeus rarely admitted weakness or doubt. On the contrary, he strived to project an image of stability and dominion. His mask of invulnerability made him seem untouchable, but at the same time, it distanced him from authentic connection with others. He severely punished any challenge, as if each gesture of contestation were a dangerous mirror that could expose his fragility. This constant repression showed how the shadow doesn't disappear when denied. It infiltrates actions, silently governs choices, and expresses itself in unexpected ways. Zeus believed he controlled Olympus, but in reality was controlled by the fear of his own fall. This conflict between persona and shadow becomes even more evident when we look at how Zeus balanced justice and tyranny. His persona, that is, the image he presented to the world, was that of a just ruler and protector of cosmic order. However, his shadow revealed jealousy, insecurities, and possessive impulses that frequently led him to act arbitrarily. The paradox is clear. The more he sought to reinforce his image as a great leader, the more he denounced the fear he carried within himself. Each demonstration of strength was also a silent request for validation. And it's precisely in this contradiction that the myth becomes so close to human experience. All of us, on some level, struggle to maintain masks that hide our fragilities. When reflecting on Zeus's shadow, we perceive how this archetype crosses through our own life. How many times do we rely on rigid postures just to hide internal insecurities? How many times do we confuse hardness with courage or control with true authority? The myth reminds us that the shadow shouldn't be denied, but recognized. Zeus, with all his greatness and hidden fears, shows us that even the most powerful of gods had something to hide. And perhaps it's precisely by looking at our shadows that we find the chance to integrate what we have that's most human, achieving a balance between strength and vulnerability. Power, when concentrated in a single figure, has the capacity to amplify not only virtues, but also the deepest defects. In Zeus's case, absolute power made him greater than other gods, but also more vulnerable to his own weaknesses. Instead of giving him security, this power left him in a constant state of alert. It's as if each gesture of leadership were accompanied by the fear of losing control. Thus, Zeus's grandeur wasn't free from shadows, but was precisely the stage where they manifested with intensity. This dynamic becomes clear when we analyze the struggle between his persona and his shadow. Zeus's persona was that of a just ruler, defender of order, and maintainer of harmony on Olympus. This public image served as a mask, a role he performed to be accepted and respected. But his shadow, hidden backstage, revealed jealousy, possessiveness, anger, and tyranny. This internal struggle between what he showed and what he hid was part of the essence of his power. And the greater the distance between persona and shadow, the greater was the tension he carried within himself. Absolute power can also generate the illusion of invulnerability. Zeus showed himself as untouchable, as if nothing could reach him. However, this posture was fragile because it required constant maintenance. Any sign of weakness could shake his image, and therefore he severely repressed whoever dared to question him. This need to seem invincible revealed precisely the opposite, the awareness that his position wasn't as solid as it appeared. Thus, strength became a mask that hid the fear of crumbling. In psychology, we can observe something similar in human leaders, both political and business, or even in family dynamics. The more they centralize power, the more they become prisoners of their own image. Power, which should bring autonomy, ends up enslaving because it demands constant reaffirmation. This was exactly what happened with Zeus. With each demonstration of strength, there was also a silent confession of insecurity. Power didn't liberate, but created an invisible prison made of expectations, fears, and control. Another important point is how power distorts relationships. Zeus saw in others not just partners or allies, but potential threats. This vision distanced him from genuine bonds, making his interactions strategic and often authoritarian. Power placed him at the center, but also isolated him. Similarly, in human daily life, we can see how the search for control and status can generate loneliness, since relationships transform into instruments of affirmation instead of spaces for true connection. The psychology of power, therefore, shows us a paradox. The more someone tries to protect themselves through the image of invulnerability, the more they expose their fragility. It's as if excess strength revealed, by contrast, the hidden insecurity. In Zeus's case, this translated into tyranny and possessiveness. In us, it can appear as arrogance, the need to always be right, or inability to admit mistakes. Power, when not balanced by humility, becomes a reflection of the shadows we don't want to face. Therefore, when looking at Zeus, we don't see just a distant myth, but an archetype that repeats itself in different contexts of real life. He invites us to reflect on how we deal with our own portions of power, whether in relationships, at work, or even in the family. True strength isn't in hiding vulnerabilities behind masks, but in recognizing them without fear. Zeus, with all his grandeur and contradictions, is a reminder that power without self-knowledge can transform into prison, and that only by integrating shadow and persona is it possible to achieve balance. When we look at Zeus and his behavior, it's tempting to think we're talking about something distant, belonging only to a god or great historical figures. But if we pay attention, we'll see that there's an inner Zeus in each of us. He appears in moments of need for control, in the desire to be recognized, or in the difficulty of admitting mistakes. It's not about saying we're tyrants like Zeus, but understanding that his mythology functions as a mirror. In different scales, we all carry traits of narcissism and a search for power affirmation that can manifest in daily life. A clear example is the need to be right in discussions. How many times do we prolong a debate not because we want to find the truth, but because we want to emerge as winners? This posture approaches that of Zeus, who rarely accepted being contradicted. Instead of dialoguing with openness, we often use arguments as weapons to reinforce our position. This impulse, even if unconscious, reveals how much the ego can interfere in the way we deal with others. Like Zeus, we prefer to protect our image of authority rather than recognize the validity of others' opinions. Another striking point is the desire to be admired. Zeus constantly needed to reaffirm his greatness, whether through feats, conquests, or even by displaying his romances. In daily life, this need can appear in behaviors like wanting to be praised at work, seeking social recognition, or measuring one's own value by others' gaze. This doesn't mean that seeking validation is always negative, but that, when exaggerated, it transforms into a burden. We live in a time when external approval can easily become the center of life, and this connects us directly to Zeus's psychological dynamic. It's also common to see this archetype in situations where we use power or influence to feel superior. It's not necessary to govern an Olympus for this to happen. Often, small positions of authority, like being a boss, leader of a group, or even an older family member, become stages for exercising a kind of inner Zeus. If this power is used with balance, it can be positive. But when it's used only to reinforce the ego, we end up reproducing the same authoritarian patterns we find in Greek mythology. These traits also appear in how we deal with insecurities. Zeus projected an image of invulnerability, but behind it was a constant fear of losing the throne. We, in daily life, can act similarly when we hide fragilities behind rigid postures, or when we use authority as a mask for vulnerability. This tendency reveals how Zeus's mythical figure isn't so distant from our human experience. Everyone, at some point, has tried to seem stronger than they really felt. Another everyday example is in the small power struggles that happen in relationships. Whether between couples, friends, or work colleagues, often what's at stake isn't the issue being discussed, but who holds more influence over the situation. This need to have the last word is a direct reflection of Zeus's archetype. Just as he strived to maintain absolute control over Olympus, we too can fall into the trap of transforming simple interactions into ego battles. It's worth highlighting that the inner Zeus doesn't need to be seen only negatively. He can also represent confidence, leadership, and the ability to take responsibility. The problem arises when we let this side dominate completely, obscuring our empathy and humility. The challenge then isn't to eliminate Zeus's archetype in us, but to integrate it in a balanced way. Just as in Jungian psychology, the integration of opposites is what brings us closer to wholeness and maturation. A practical way to observe the inner Zeus is to pay attention to our reactions when faced with criticism. When we respond with openness and seek to learn, we're balancing our ego. But when we react defensively, as if a contrary opinion were a threat to our value, we're repeating Zeus's patterns. This awareness helps us not fall into automatism and transform conflict situations into growth opportunities. Another field of reflection is perceiving how much we use achievements as instruments of self-affirmation. There's no problem in feeling proud of what we accomplish, but when each victory serves only to place us above others, we fall into the same cycle as Zeus, the endless need for reaffirmation. This traps us in a search without end, where it's never enough. True freedom lies in recognizing the value of achievements without transforming them into currency of power. Finally, Zeus's myth invites us to look inward and question, to what extent are our attitudes moved by the desire for power and recognition? And to what extent can we balance this desire with humility and empathy? By identifying the inner Zeus, we don't seek to eliminate him, but to understand his presence. He can be strength and inspiration as long as he doesn't transform into tyranny. Balance lies in recognizing both the need for affirmation and the importance of opening ourselves to others, building relationships less based on power and more on dialogue. Zeus didn't remain only in ancient myths. His image has crossed centuries, and today appears in various forms in pop culture. Many modern narratives bring leaders or characters who carry this Zeus complex. Powerful, centralizing figures who appear to be invincible but hide deep insecurities. It's the archetype of the king who fears losing the crown. In movies and series, we see this pattern in characters who, at first glance, seem unbeatable, but who live tormented by the possibility of falling. Think of authoritarian leaders in fantasy universes, superheroes who place themselves above others, or even villains who constantly seek to reaffirm their dominion. They all carry something of Zeus in their attitudes. In comics, for example, characters like certain magnates or reinvented gods assume this role of absolute centrality. They govern not only with power, but with a vanity that demands constant recognition. This mixture of grandeur and fragility creates complex figures, who fascinate because they reflect very human dilemmas. In pop culture, this archetype also appears critically, showing the limits of absolute power. Contemporary films and narratives question to what extent leaders really control destiny, or if they just try to disguise their insecurities. The message is clear. The more a character tries to seem invulnerable, the more their fragilities become visible. Thus, Zeus remains alive not only as myth, but as a symbolic model that inspires modern narratives. By recognizing this pattern in pop culture characters, we can also see the reflections within ourselves. The myth continues to be current because it speaks directly of power, ego, and vulnerability, themes that never stop accompanying us. When looking at Zeus, we perceive much more than a god from Greek mythology. He becomes a powerful mirror of our own human contradictions. On one side, he represents strength, power, and authority. On the other, he reveals the fear of loss, insecurity, and the constant need to be recognized. It's in this tension that the myth gains depth, because it invites us to see that behind all greatness, there's always a hidden fragility. Zeus's myth, therefore, isn't just an ancient story, but a living metaphor for reflecting on our ego. Every time we feel the need to be above others, seek admiration at any cost, or use our influence to impose wills, we're reliving this archetype within us. Recognizing the inner Zeus isn't a condemnation, but a chance to understand how power and vanity can infiltrate the small choices of daily life. Psychology shows us that the more we try to sustain the image of invulnerability, the more we distance ourselves from who we really are. Just as Zeus created masks of authority to hide his shadow, we too often hide our insecurities behind rigid postures or authoritarian attitudes. The real challenge isn't in eliminating the desire for power, but in learning to balance it with humility and authenticity. In this sense, Zeus functions as an invitation to self-analysis. He provokes us to ask, what are the fragilities I try to hide? In what moments do I place my ego above my relationships? To what extent do I seek recognition instead of genuine connection? These questions may seem uncomfortable, but they're precisely the ones that help us grow and build healthier relationships. Pop culture, as we've seen, already explores these questions by portraying leaders and characters with the Zeus complex. But the great transformation happens when we stop looking only outward and begin to reflect inward. It's not enough to recognize the archetype in gods, heroes, or villains. We need to perceive how it manifests in our everyday behavior. It's at this point that mythology and psychology meet, showing that myths aren't dead, but alive within us. Finally, Zeus's myth teaches us that power, when sustained only by ego, is always fragile. True strength emerges when we're capable of recognizing our vulnerabilities without fear. Balancing personal power with humility may be one of the greatest learnings this God story can offer us. And by accepting our own shadows, we stop being prisoners of them and approach a more conscious, more authentic, and more human life. Thus, the final invitation is simple but profound. Observe your own inner Zeus. Ask yourself what masks of power and vanity you wear every day. And, more importantly, reflect on what it would be like to live without needing them. Because in the end, the greatest power isn't in seeming invincible, but in courageously assuming what we really are.